You've milled your wheat, and now you have freshly milled flour. And in this moment, some questions may be popping into your brain besides, what can I do with this? Questions like, can I freeze this? How long will this flour last? What if I milled too much flour? How much wheat berries does it take to mill into flour? Today, I'm going to be addressing many of these common questions I get about freshly milled flour. Hey everyone, welcome back to Grains and Grit. My name is Felicia, and on this channel, we talk about all things real whole grains from a biblical perspective. So as I stated, I'm going to be answering some common questions that I get about the actual flour part when you've milled your grains and now you have this flour. And these are questions besides, what recipes to use. So some of the common questions that I get that I'm going to be addressing in this video is, when can I mill my flour / how far in advance can I mill it to bake with it? What happens if I have leftover flour? What can I do with it? Do you need to allow your flour to cool before baking? And of course, how long does freshly milled flour actually last? So let's dive in and get started. So the first one, and I get this, is how far in advance can I mill my flour? Can I store it to bake on another day? Things like that. And the simple answer to this question is you mill your wheat berries into flour right before you're ready to bake with it. There are a couple exceptions to this, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the main reason that we want to mill our wheat fresh and use it is so that we can take advantage of all of the nutrients that are in the wheat berry. They have been locked inside that wheat berry, and they are still in that wheat berry until it has been cracked open or sprouted in some capacity. The biggest nutrient that is pretty much lost almost immediately is vitamin E, which is absolutely crucial to have, especially because wheat is the king of vitamin E. That germ, the wheat germ, contains the most vitamin E than any other food. It completely blows it out of the water. But vitamin E is one of those nutrients that are oxidized right off the bat very, very quickly. So according to Sue Becker's numbers, I've listened to a talk with her before, and if you've listened to her, you've probably heard these numbers too. But basically by day one of milling the wheat, of turning those wheat berries into flour, by the end of day one, 45% of the nutrients have been oxidized. And again, this is mainly vitamin E. Not all nutrients oxidize, but you do have many that do. And by just the end of day one, 45% is gone, lost forever. You're not getting it back. By day 3, 90% is completely lost and gone. The biggest reason, again, is you mill it when you're ready to use it. Now, there are two exceptions to this. One being, and again, I would like to emphasize these are exceptions, meaning you are not doing them all the time. They are exceptions to this. And that is, the only time that I will mill my flour in advance is, say I want to make muffins or pancakes or something on for breakfast one morning. This is especially on Sunday mornings where I may want to sleep in a little bit, or, those type of things. Or the biggest thing is, I don't want to wake up the whole house by turning on my grain mill. Many times I will actually mill the flour the night before, so that way I already have the flour ready to go by the next morning that I can use, and I just keep it in my fridge to slow down that oxidation process. But again, this is not all the time. This is not my everyday bread baking or anything like that. These are exceptions. So that's one thing that you certainly can do, but just know, and I'm aware, that certain nutrients are starting to be lost a little bit. But every now and then, it's okay. The second exception is if you're making pie crust. Now, this is not a huge exception, but whenever you're making pie crust, if you've seen my videos, all of your ingredients need to be cold. And so I do not recommend taking your freshly milled grains because they are a little heated, they are warm, and then immediately making pie crust with it because it's going to mess with your fats. So I actually do recommend either throwing it in the freezer to quickly cool down, or in your fridge if you're making it later that day or something like that, to basically get it cool and cold to help you with the pie crust. But again, those are the only 2 exceptions. Do not mill on Monday in order to bake bread on Saturday. That is not recommended at all. All right, so that answers question number 1. Question number 2 is one that I get often, and that is what to do with leftover flour. Many times when you mill and you end up not having exactly the amount of flour that you need, there are times where you have leftover flour, and what to do with that, because we don't want to waste it. First and foremost, and this will take practice and you will learn as you go, is to actually try to mill what you need for whatever recipe you're baking. And a general rule of thumb to remember is 1 cup of wheat berries equals about 1.5 cups of flour. This will vary a little bit depending on what wheat berries you're using, but that is a general rule. So whenever I see, 9.5 cups of flour needed for a recipe, I generally know, okay, probably need to stick with 6 cups of grains. At least start with that. You can always mill a little more. That's totally fine. But that's a general rule, and try to just mill what you need. Don't go overboard with it. Now, I usually do have a little bit of flour left over, and there are 2 things that I do with it. One is that I usually keep a Ziploc bag in my freezer of any leftover flour. Now, when I say leftover flour, I rarely have more than 1 cup of flour left over. Usually it's less than that. I'm pretty good about getting it pretty much down, using all of it, even for dusting and things like that. But whenever I do have some flour left over, I actually keep a bag and I throw that flour into the Ziploc bag and put it in my freezer. And that flour I actually use for those times where I may only need 1 or 2 tablespoons of flour, maybe a 1/4 cup of flour. These are like when I'm making my gravies or when a recipe calls for just a little bit of flour and I'm not wanting to go mill wheat for 1 tablespoon of flour. That is a perfect time that I just go in and scoop whatever I need out and use it. So very handy to have for those times when you just need just a little bit, or say you get to whenever you're baking your current recipe and you find that you were just a little bit short of flour. Instead of going to mill some more, you can pull from that stash as well. So that's the first thing I do with it, is just keep a little Ziploc bag in the freezer. Use it for those times when you just need a little bit of flour. The second thing that I do with it is because, this does not apply to everyone, but I am usually baking something every single day, nearly every single day. And so sometimes I just save that little bit of flour and I use it the next time I do some baking. I just add it in to that recipe. Again, it's not a lot. I'm not talking like 6 cups of flour, maybe half a cup or a cup, maybe a cup and a half of flour. That's not the great bulk of the recipe that I'm using. And so I usually just keep it in the bowl and use it the next time. But again, I'm generally baking every day or every other day. So those are some ideas for when you have leftover flour. Question number 3 is, do you need to allow your flour to cool down before baking? And this one I get, I think, especially from people who are bakers and they're switching to freshly milled wheat and they immediately notice, wow, this flour is warmer than store-bought flour, which is obviously true. It's just been through a lot of friction there. So generally speaking, no, you do not need to cool it down before baking. Again, these breads, especially for yeast breads, you're wanting it in a warm environment anyway for yeast. So it's perfectly fine to mill it and immediately use it. The exception, as I've already mentioned earlier, are pie crust, because we want everything to be cool or cold when making pie crust, so it doesn't start melting your fat. So that's the only exception, but generally speaking, use it right away. All right, question number 4, last but not least, how long does freshly milled flour last? Now, it's funny whenever I receive this question, because to be honest, I think it's a completely irrelevant question. Because for us true grainies, we stock up on the wheat berries, not the flour. We focus on the whole grains to mill it fresh, so we're not worried about having to store flour. But for those of you who are just curious of how long freshly milled flour lasts, I do not actually know from experience, because again, I do it I do it on demand whenever I need it. I get flour basically on demand. But according to Google, freshly milled flour, if stored properly out, not in a fridge or a freezer, usually lasts anywhere from 3 to 9 months. And by last, I mean that you've lost a lot of your nutrients, but it at least hasn't gone rancid. So 3 to 9 months. As far as in the freezer, so this is relevant if you have a little bag of a little bit of flour in there. Many people state that it can last up to 6 months. But again, with the exception of your little bag in the freezer that I'm usually going through very fast anyway, there's no reason that you, my friends, who are following me on this channel, should be storing flour. No. We store the wheat berries, the whole grains, not the flour. So that is actually my answer to this, is don't focus on the flour, focus on the grains, and then mill them yourself fresh. So hopefully this helps answer many of y'all's questions regarding the actual flour part of our freshly milled flour. And if you're looking for places to buy grains so you can have your flour on demand, freshly milled and true whole grain flour, then be sure to check out my website. Got a new URL this time to make it easier to remember, grainsandgrit.com/buygrains. And I'll be sure to link it here and in the description box below. But there on my website, I do keep a running list. I do try to keep it updated with the places that I recommend to purchase your wheat berries from, as well as any and all coupon codes that I have for y'all. So be sure to check it out. Again, grainsandgrit.com/buygrains. And as always, I hope this video was helpful for y'all. Hope you have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next week. Bye.